There is a common myth that many Canadians believe about Indigenous people of Canada, the myth of the wandering nomad. This is the myth that all Indigenous people were historically nomadic wanderers. This myth is extremely detrimental because Indigenous people did not wander around the land aimlessly. According to the Canadian government website, there are over 50 Indigenous nations of Canada today, and there are over 50 Indigenous languages. By believing the myth that all Indigenous people were wandering nomads, Canadians are continuing to believe that all Indigenous nations are the same and all practice the same traditions. Typically, people believe that historically Indigenous people were all the same hunter-gatherer, wandering nomads that lived in teepees. Many of the Plains Indigenous people lived in teepees, followed the buffalo, and as a food source, but they did not pick up and move every single day as many would believe. The Indigenous nations that typically followed the buffalo were skilled hunters and gatherers that knew the resources of the land that they frequented yearly. For example, the Indigenous people would need to know the difference between various plant life, including the difference between a wild parsnip, which is an edible root plant, and the water hemlock, which is a poisonous plant if ingested. The Plains Indigenous people were only a few Indigenous nations that populated Canada before European contact. The Haudenosaunee are an Indigenous nation that had very different traditional history from the Plains Indigenous people. One of the main differences between the two groups is that the Haudenosaunee people typically lived in one area and were farmers. The three main crops that the Haudenosaunee grew were corn, beans, and squash, which together they called the Three Sisters. Another difference between the two nations is that the Haudenosaunee did not live in teepees, but instead lived in longhouses. As a Canadian, it is important to understand that not all Indigenous people lived in teepees and hunted the buffalo. Each nation is unique and have their own traditional practices. There may be some overlap between nations, but each nation is still unique in their own way. Indigenous people in Canada were not wandering nomads. But instead, they were skilled hunters that followed their food source. They were skilled gatherers that knew the land they lived on. And some nations were skilled farmers that knew how to farm and grow crops before European contact. You cannot lump all Indigenous people into one large culture. Each nation is different and must be honored and respected.